The deed of peace was still wet where her uncle had signed it when Eleanor Vane understood that no one at the long table had thought to ask whether she was willing to go. It lay between the tarnished candlesticks in the cold best parlor at Underhill, 2 skins of vellum 30 years in the making, and every man in the room was looking at it, at the great red seals, at the sum written out in words, at the restored acres marching down the schedule like soldiers coming home, and not one of them was looking at her, though it was her own name that had been engrossed in the blank space where the bride went, in a hired clerk's fair round hand, Eleanor Vane, spinster, of Underhill, 24 years old and worth to the family that had bred her. Exactly 1 signature, and not a shilling more. She had known for a fortnight that it would be her. There had never truly been a doubt of it. The Vanes owned one thing of value in the world, and it was not the mortgaged house, nor the meadows the lawyers had swallowed, nor the name 3 generations of chancery had worn thin. It was her cousin Arabella's face. And no man alive spent a face like Arabella's on the beast of Aldermere. So the family had done its cold arithmetic, the same it had always done, and arrived, as it always arrived, at Eleanor, the plain daughter, the quiet one, the one who read, the one who could be got out of the house at last and turned into acres. For that was the whole of the bargain, and the county had it by heart within a day. The Duke of Aldermere, whom no one had seen above the length of a park in a dozen years, had offered to do the thing 3 parishes had thought impossible, to end the great suit that had bled both houses for 30 years, the endless, ruinous quarrel over the mill at Fenn's Cross and the water meadow it stood in, begun before Eleanor was born, and fit to go on after she was dead, to restore to the Vanes the disputed land entire, and a settlement besides, and clear the family's law debts to the last groat. He asked one thing in return, a Vane daughter to marry, to bind the 2 bloodlines, and lay the feud to rest for good, so that no lawyer need ever grow fat on Fenn's Cross again. He did not name which daughter, too proud or too used to being refused to name one, and her uncle Ambrose had read the letter twice, glanced once at Arabella arranging flowers by the window, and once at Eleanor mending the estate accounts at the table, and had known his own mind before the tea was poured. So Eleanor sat now with her hands folded on the black stuff of her gown, and understood that she was being given to the man her family had taught her, since before she could walk, to fear as a child fears the dark and hate, as only the wrong know how. For it was an article of the Vane faith, recited on every winter anniversary of the fire, that Gabriel, Duke of Aldermere, had murdered her uncle Hugh, had set the mill at Fenn's Cross alight in the night to burn the Vanes' claim to ash, so that poor gallant Hugh, sainted for it since, ran into the flames to save the family papers, and never came out, and that the beast had got his scarred face in the doing of it, and had rung the mill bell across the black water as the roof fell, ringing and ringing, the county said, like a devil tolling for the soul he had taken. Eleanor had never heard that bell. The mill had stood a burnt shell behind its fence her whole life, but she had heard it tolled 100 times, until the sound of it lived in her, the way a hymn lives in a child raised to sing it, whether or not she believed a word. She wore, on the 3rd finger of her right hand, the jet mourning ring the family put on every Vane at coming of age, a plain dark ring for Hugh, the murdered uncle, so that the wrong should never be forgotten. She had worn it 7 years. She wore it now, going to the murderer, because Ambrose had told her to, and because she had learned long ago that there were cheaper battles to win than the ones over jewelry. "You will oblige me, Eleanor," her uncle said, sliding the deed and the pen down the table without lifting his eyes, by reading nothing and signing quickly. "His Grace's man is waiting, and the light is going." "I will oblige you, uncle," said Eleanor, "by reading everything and signing carefully." "His Grace's man may have a candle. There are 2 on the table doing nothing but flatter Arabella." She drew the deed to her. She was aware of her uncle turning the color of a man not used to being crossed by furniture, and of the Duke's attorney, a spare, exact gray man named Ray, who had ridden over with the settlement in a locked box, going very still by the cold hearth, watching her with an attention she felt on the side of her face like a draught. And she read, the whole of it, both skins, line by line, because she had decided that if she was to be spent, she would at least know the price, and that a woman who signs a paper she has not read has agreed to whatever the cleverer man across the table pleases. She found what she expected, and one thing she did not. What she expected was generosity so large it frightened her. The debts cleared. The land restored, a settlement that would keep Ambrose in claret the rest of his life, a man buying his peace at a price no one drives who has anything to hide, she thought, and put the thought away, because it did not suit the story she had been raised on. What she did not expect was the second document folded behind the deed, a copy, in an old clerk's hand, of a boundary roll. An ancient terrier of the Aldermere lands, 3 generations old and gone brown at the folds. She read it too, and a small cold thing turned over in her at the foot of the second column, where the old surveyor had set down the line of the brook and the mill and the meadow at Fenn's Cross, because the line he had drawn was not the line the lawsuit had spent 30 years and 2 fortunes and 1 man's life disputing, and it was not close. She said nothing about it. She was not sure enough, and she had learned that the person who speaks before she is sure hands the advantage to the person who waits. She folded the roll back along its creases and turned to the settlement. There are 2 things wanting. Mr. Ray, and then I shall sign. Name them, Miss Vane, said Ray, and there was something in the dryness of it that was almost approval. The first is my own. I will have my maintenance settled to my sole and separate use, not touching my uncle, not touching any Vane, not to be reached by any creditor of any Vane living or unborn. I have watched what becomes of money that passes through this family's hands. Mr. Ray, it becomes weather. I do not intend to be weather. Her uncle made a sound. Ray inclined his head and wrote, The second is not my own, and it is the one I care for. There are 9 tenant families on the Underhill land this deed restores. The Croys, the Bettses, old Sarah Dine at the mill cottage, the rest, who have paid their rents faithfully through 30 years of a lawsuit that let their roofs rot, because the money went to attorneys and not to slates. I will have it written that not one of them can be turned off the land while they pay and behave, this year or in 20 years, whatever passes between the families. If I am the price of Fenn's Cross, that is my price. His Grace may keep the whole meadow before I sell those 9 families for a settlement. The room was silent. Ambrose looked at his niece as though a chair had risen up and made terms, and Ray took off his spectacles and polished them and put them on again. His Grace instructed me, he said, that whatever the lady asked for, within reason and the law, I was to grant. This I can grant, Miss Vane. I will draw it tonight, and you shall see it engrossed before you sign. And I will tell you plainly that in 30 years of this work I have never before heard the party being married ask first after the tenants. His Grace will find it of interest. His Grace may find it whatever he pleases, said Eleanor. It is 3 o'clock, and I have been sold before dinner. Draw the clause, Mr. Ray, and I will sign your master's peace and go to his house, and see for myself whether the county has ever told me the truth about anything at all, for it has been wrong about me the whole of my life, and I begin to wonder what else it has got by heart and never once examined. She signed on the Friday, and on the Monday she went north to Aldermere, to the man they said had burned her uncle alive, with the mourning ring on her hand and the copy of the old boundary roll, which Mr. Ray, asked civilly, had let her keep, folded flat in the bottom of her workbox, under the thread. Aldermere Hall stood a full day's cold travel to the north, at the end of a broken avenue where the elms had been let grow wild for want of a master who cared to see them, in a park gone half to bracken. Eleanor had heard of the house all her life, the way one hears of houses in the darker sort of story. Shut, they said, the great rooms under Holland, no company these dozen years, no music, and no bell rung in all that house, because his grace could not endure a bell, not since the night the mill bell tolled at Fenn's cross, and had taken every bell in the place down with his own hands. The stable clock struck dumb, and the chapel bell lowered from the tower, and the bell pulls cut from the walls, so that Aldermere was a house you could not ring in. She sat in the hired chaise, and watched the great grey house come up through the wild trees in the last of the light, and told her heart, as one tells a nervous horse on a bridge, to walk on and mind its feet. The Duke had not come out. A man does not stand on his steps in the cold to greet the hostage his lawyer has fetched. It was the housekeeper who met her under the porch, a spare, upright, iron-grey woman of 60, with a great ring of keys at her waist, and a face that had long ago given up the habit of showing anything, who curtsied and said, "Your Grace, I am Mrs. Tarrant. The house is glad of you," in a voice that made it wholly impossible to tell whether the house was anything of the kind. "Thank you, Mrs. Tarrant," said Eleanor, getting down stiff and cold and determined into the enemy's hall. "I imagine the house has heard a great deal of nonsense about me, the plain Vane girl, the one they could spare. I will save it the trouble of finding out. It is all true, and none of it signifies. I keep accounts, I read a bailiff's roll and a leaking roof, I do not faint. And I am not afraid of this house, whatever it has decided to be. Shall we begin with where I am to sleep? I have been 2 days in a chaise, and I should like to be useful by morning." Something moved, very far back in the housekeeper's iron face. Eleanor would learn months on that it was the moment Mrs. Tarrant went down, and quietly stopped the below-stairs betting on how many nights the new Duchess would last, and the woman said, "This way, Your Grace," and led her up. The rooms they had given her were in the south front, and they stopped her on the threshold, not because they were grand, though they were, but because they were warm, and because of the light. Fires burned in both grates, banked and screened behind close brass guards so that not a spark could travel, and on the mantel stood not bare candlesticks, but small shielded lamps, each with its chimney of horn, made so that a flame could burn all night beside a sleeper and never stand naked in the room. The lamps of a house that knew to the bone what an unwatched flame could do, and would not have one loose under its roof. And on the table by the window, squared neatly to the edge, stood a single object that stopped her breath. It was a small silver christening cup, dented and very plain, with VV chased on the side. It was a Vane cup. It was, she knew it at once, her own father's christening cup. The one thing of worth that Chancery had stripped out of Underhill in the bad year she was 10, carried off in a bailiff's cart, given up for lost, mourned by her father to the day he died. It stood on her table in the house of the man supposed to have destroyed her family, filled with the same red winter hips, waiting for her as though it had never been away. "Mrs. Tarrant, this cup, where did it come from?" "His Grace, madam. His Grace cannot have known it was my father's." "I'm sure I couldn't say, madam," said Mrs. Tarrant, whose face said with great composure that she could say perfectly well and would not, and she curtsied and went out, and left the new Duchess of Aldermere standing alone in the warm and carefully lighted room, holding her dead father's cup in both hands in the enemy's house, listening to her own heart, which she had told to walk on, stopped dead in the road, and refused to go a step further until it had been told what on earth was happening. They were married that same week, quietly, in the little chapel of the hall, before almost nobody, Mrs. Tarrant, and Ray, and an old parson named Mr. Grey, who had christened the Duke and plainly meant to keep the habit of weeping in that chapel up. Eleanor wore her grey silk and no veil, and the jet ring. She had thought a long time about the ring, and left it on, because she would not begin a marriage in a lie, and the truth was that she still, that morning, half believed she was marrying her uncle's murderer, and thought he had a right to see her wear her doubt honestly where he could read it. The Duke came in at the last, out of a side door, and stood beside her at the rail, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor Vane stood close enough to the Beast of Aldermere to see what the county had been so busy about for 20 years. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, dark near 40, and along the left side of his jaw and up toward the temple ran an old burn scar, long-healed. Not the raw horror of the fireside stories, but a pale, taut seam in a grave and rather handsome face, the kind of mark one saw and then, oddly, a moment later half stopped seeing. His hands were marked the same, drawn and shining, and he held them a little turned away, with the habit of a man who had spent 20 years being looked at. His eyes, when they came to her, were a dark gray and very steady, and held an expression she could not read. "Miss Vane," he said, low, before the parson began. His voice was rough and quiet, like a wheel on gravel. "You wear mourning. I do, your grace, for my Uncle Hugh. You will know the story better than I. I was not born. I will not take it off to please the day, and I will not pretend I do not know what the county says was done to him, and by whom. I have come to keep the bargain my family made, and I will keep it faithfully. But I will not lie to you at an altar about what I believe I am marrying. You would find me out inside a week, and think the less of me, and be right to." She braced for anger. What she got instead undid her more than anger could have. The Duke looked at the black ring on her hand, and something crossed his scarred face that she had no name for then, and he said so quietly that only she could hear, "No, do not take it off. Of all the people who have ever come into this house, madam, you are the first to come honest. Wear your ring. Believe what you believe. I would rather be married by a woman who thinks me a murderer and keeps her word than by one who smiles and does not." And he turned to old Mr. Grey and said, "Begin, if you please," and married her. There was no bell. Of course there was no bell. The marriage was made in a silence so complete that she heard the winter birds outside and the small settling of the fire in the vestry grate. And no bell rang over the union of Aldermere and Vane, though every wedding in that country for 1,000 years had gone out on a peal, because the man beside her could not bear the sound, and she did not yet know why, and thought she did. She dined alone that first night, at one end of a table that could have seated 40, in a silence so deep she could hear the wine come into the glass. His Grace, the old butler Odell told her, begged to be excused. His Grace kept to himself of an evening. She dined alone the second night, and the third. She was not offended. She had gathered enough to know it was not rudeness, but a locked door with a man behind it who had forgotten there was a key. The whole vast house was arranged, she came to see, around a single silence. At the center of it, a man who had decided long ago that the kindest thing he could do the world was to be neither seen nor heard in it. He had bought her family's peace and asked nothing. He had given her back her father's cup and warmed her rooms and shielded every flame against her coming, and he meant to go on giving and asking nothing, at the far dark end of the house, for the whole of their 2 lives. Eleanor bore it for 3 dinners. On the 4th day, having established from Mrs. Tarrant that his Grace was to be found most afternoons in the muniment room, she put down her book and went to find her husband where he lived. The muniment room was a long, low, chamber-lined floor to ceiling with the deed boxes and map drawers of 600 years, smelling of vellum and cold iron and beeswax, and at a great scarred table in the middle of it, in his shirt sleeves with the marked hands bare, the Duke sat alone over a spread of estate maps, doing his own steward's work, Because idleness, she would learn, was the one enemy the fire had left him that he could still fight, and he fought it every waking hour. He rose fast when she came in, and turned his scarred side from the light by pure habit, and said, "Madam, is something wanting? You have only to ring," and stopped, because of course there was no bell to ring in all his house, and the flat impossibility of his own sentence struck them both, and for one instant they looked at each other across the gulf of it, with something that was nearly, on both sides, the beginning of a smile. "Nothing is wanting, your grace. That is rather the difficulty. I have been 3 days being wanted nothing of, and I find it does not agree with me. I was not raised to be an ornament. I have not the face for it, as my family took pains to remind me. I keep accounts. I read maps. You have here the finest muddle of unread documents I have seen since I opened my uncle's strong-box. I mean to help you, because I shall go mad in that pretty room otherwise. Sit down. Show me what you are about. I read a terrier faster than any man you employ, and I do not talk while I do it." He looked at her a long moment across the maps, the scarred man in his shirt sleeves being told by a plain woman in black that she meant to be of use to him, and something in the gray eyes shifted, the way deep water shifts when the wind changes far out, and he drew out the chair beside his own, and set it. She saw him do it without knowing he did, a little nearer the fire, on the warm side, before he said, "Sit." Then, "Here is the estate. God knows it wants a second pair of eyes. I have read these alone so long I no longer see them." And that was how the marriage of purchase between the beast and the bought bride began, roll by roll, to become something that had not been in anybody's bargain. She learned the house through its papers, and the man through the house. She learned that the Underhill tenants' arrears, the 30 years of rotted roofs, were being made good, cottage by cottage, out of Aldermere's own purse and by Aldermere's own men. Quietly, under no name, she found the accounts of it in his hand, and said nothing, and thought a great deal. She learned that the pension list of Aldermere carried the widows and broken servants of both houses, without distinction of blood, that a Vane groom crippled in the old lord's time drew his half-crown a week from the man his family cursed at dinner. She learned that her husband rose before light, and rode the estate in all weathers, and knew every soul on it by name, feared by none who lived close enough to know him, and dreaded by all who lived far enough off to only tell the story. And there was one place on all the estate her husband would not let her go, the mill at Fenn's Cross, on the very boundary the deed had restored, still a burnt black shell behind its old fence 20 years on, that no one at Aldermere spoke of, and no one was suffered to approach. "You will not go to the mill," he said, the only time in those first weeks his quiet voice went hard. "I ask you one thing in this house, and it is that. The rest is yours, every room, every book, every key on Mrs. Tarrant's ring, but the two that open nothing anyone need open. But not the mill. I will give you that, for now, and without understanding it, because you have given me my father's cup and asked me nothing. But I will tell you plainly, since we began honest, a locked door in a marriage is a lodger who pays no rent, and sooner or later one of us will tire of feeding it. When you are ready to open that door, I will be here, and I would rather hear whatever is behind it from you, by daylight, than find it for myself, which you should know. Having married the woman who reads, I am uncommonly good at." He did not answer, but that night, at dinner for the first time, the Duke of Aldermere came down. He came late and stiffly, like a man walking into cold water to the chest, and took the great chair at the head with his scarred cheek turned from the candles, and said, "By way of good evening, you will find me poor company, madam. I have been out of the way of it a long time." And Eleanor, who had had Odell lay her place at his right hand that morning without asking anyone's leave, passed him the salt as though they had dined together 1,000 years. That is convenient, your grace, for I have been nobody's company at all for 24 years, so between us we make about one ordinary person, and may practice on each other without an audience. I have spent the day in your muniment room. You have a boundary roll of the year the old king came in that contradicts a roll of 30 years later on the matter of your own North Wood, and one of them has cost some ancestor of yours a great deal to be wrong about. Do you take an interest, or shall I simply mend it and report? There was a silence. He had turned, without noticing that he did it, so that the marked side of his face was full to the light and full to her, and she made herself neither stare at the scar nor look away from it, but only look at him, the way one looks at any face across a dinner table, because she had resolved on the first night that she would pay him in honest looks, and never once in the coward's currency of the glance slid sideways. "Mend it and report," said the Duke of Aldermere, and something at the ruined corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, as though remembering a use it had almost forgotten it had. She mended it and reported. That night, and the next, and the one after, and slowly, dinner by dinner, roll by roll, the silence of Aldermere began to fill, not with noise, for he could not yet bear much of that, but with talk, low, dry, particular talk of drains and boundaries, and the right management of a North Wood, and by degrees of books, for she found he had been a great reader before the fire, and had let it lapse the way he had let everything lapse that gave pleasure, on the old dark theory that pleasure was not owing to him. He was not easy, he never became, in all the years she had of him, what the world calls easy. But he listened to her as no living soul had ever troubled to, with his whole grave attention, as though her opinion on a boundary roll were a dispatch from a war, and evening by evening she came to the slow, upending understanding that the thing at the head of the table was not a monster, and never had been one. It was the shyest and most careful man she had ever known, wearing the most frightening face in the county, because the county had given it to him, and he had not had the heart or the hope to give it back. The face itself she grew used to so fast it shamed her. That was the secret no one told you about scars. They shout for a week, and then they are only a face. But she saw that he never grew used to it, that he still turned the marked side from every candle by a habit worn so deep it had grooved every posture he owned, and flinched, small and quick, whenever a servant new to the place looked a half-second too long. And one raw morning, passing through the long, cold gallery where the bell-pulls had been cut from the walls, and only the bright, unfaded rectangles remained to show where a house's voice had hung, she stopped and looked at the mute scars in the plaster, and made up her mind about something. "Mrs. Tarrant, there is no bell in this house. No, madam, not one. Not the stable clock, not the chapel, not a pull in a single room. I have been keeping a list, I keep lists. It is a house you cannot ring in. Why? You may tell me it is not your place, and I will not press you. But I am his wife, and I am trying to learn how to live in a silence I did not make." The housekeeper looked at her a long moment, weighing 30 years of loyalty against something she saw, perhaps, in the plain, steady face. "It is the mill bell, madam. The night Fenn's cross burned, the mill bell rang and rang across the water, the whole night, till the roof went. The county has its tale of it. You will have been raised on it. I was here, madam. I heard it from these steps. And I will only say to you what I have never said above stairs in 20 years, that there is more than one way to read the ringing of a bell in the dark, and the county chose the cruelest, because it is the one that makes the best telling. His Grace took every bell in this house down with his burnt hands, madam, and a man does not do that to a sound he is proud of." And she curtsied, and would say no more, and Eleanor went into her warm shielded room, and took out the old boundary roll from the bottom of her workbox, and read again the line the surveyor had drawn at Fenn's cross that did not match the lawsuit, and sat a long while thinking about bells. It was March before she asked him about the fire, and she did not ask it the way the county would have. They were riding the north boundary together in a thin, bright cold. She had taken to riding out with him in the mornings, having found that a man who cannot sit still in a room will sometimes say more from a horse than a chair, and they had come, by a way she did not at first understand he had chosen, to the low rise above the water meadow, from which one could see, small and black, and fenced across the brook, the burnt shell of the mill at Fenn's Cross. He had stopped his horse and was looking at it. And Eleanor, who had learned to tell this man's silences apart, knew that this was not the silence that wanted leaving alone, but the other kind, the kind that is a door standing an inch ajar in a cold wind. "Does it pain you still?" she said, not looking at the mill, but at the marked hand on his rein, the burns, when the weather turns. "My grandfather had an old hurt that told him of rain a day before the glass did." His hand tightened and stilled. She watched him examine the question for the trap in it, for pity, which he would have hated, or horror, which he expected, and find only what she had put there, which was a wife asking after her husband's comfort. "Yes," he said at last, "the hands before rain, the face less. The hands keep a fuller calendar than your grandfather ever did." And then, still looking at the black mill, in a voice gone flat and careful, "You want to ask me about the mill. You have wanted to for 3 months and not, which is more than I had any right to hope of a Vane. Ask, if you are going to." "I was not going to ask you what the county asks. I know what it says you did. I am not going to insult you by inviting you to deny it, as though your denial were a thing I required. I was going to ask one thing only. That morning, when they carried you out of that mill burnt half to death, the men who dug you out, did they run from you? After? When they saw your face, did your own people flinch?" He turned and looked at her then, full, the scarred side and all, with an astonishment so naked that she understood no one had ever in 20 years thought to ask him that particular question. "No, old Nash carried me out on his own back and wept over me like a child for a week, and has never once looked away from my face for shame, only for grief, which is a different thing, and which I can bear. The men who were there do not flinch. It is the ones who were not there, madam. It is always the ones who were not there. They have only the story, and the story wants a monster, and I was to hand." He looked back at the mill. "You ask better questions than the King's Bench. I begin to see why Ray came home and told me I had married an attorney by mistake." "You married a woman who reads," said Eleanor, and turned her horse gently, so that his back was to the mill and his face to the bright, empty north. "Come, it is going to rain by evening. Your hands will tell you I am right before the glass does, and I want to see the new slates on the Croy cottage before it comes down. You may tell me as we ride about old Nash, who carried you out and wept for a week. I should like to know the people who did not flinch. I am tired of the story of the ones who did. I was raised on it, and it has never once been true about anybody I have taken the trouble to know." And he told her as they rode about old Nash, and that was the first thread pulled, and after it the whole cloth began to come unwoven. For old Nash, the ancient steward who had carried the burnt boy out on his back, took after that to appearing wherever the new duchess happened to be, with some errand to excuse him, letting fall, sidelong, the parts of her husband's history the county's tale left out. That his grace had been 18 the year of the fire, a laughing dark second son, not yet the grave-scarred man, that the title had come to him sideways, his elder brother dead of a fever the winter before, and his father broken by grief. That there had been a young lady, before, here Nashe grew careful, a Miss Cassandra Aldous, the beauty of that year, as good as promised to the second son while he was whole and rich, who discovered urgent business elsewhere, when the fire took his face, and the county gave him the name, and married a baronet within the 12-month, and was Lady Sturt now. that his grace had never spoken her name since. But that it was not the fire, Nashi said, low, and not the lady either, that had shut the house and taken down the bells. It was the thing in between, the thing the boy had learned in the burning and carried alone ever since, and never told a living soul, the thing a body would have to be told by his grace himself, or not at all. And who, said Eleanor quietly, do you think in 20 years his grace might ever come to trust so far? The old man looked at her, and at the jet ring she still wore, and at the shielded lamp she carried against the passage cold. I've an old man's notion, madam, if you'll forgive it. I think he's been waiting for someone who'd walk into this house believing the worst of him and treat him kind anyway, not kind because she'd been persuaded he was good, but kind while she still thought him a devil. He could never trust the persuaded ones, too easy. But a Vane, madam, in a Vane's mourning ring, who thinks he killed her own blood and warms his rooms for him regardless. Nashi's voice cracked. Don't you let him carry it alone when he goes to tell you. He's been alone in it since he was a boy of 18, and it's heavy enough to have bent a stronger back than his. Eleanor did not answer. She went instead, that afternoon, to a low-locked press in the darkest corner of the muniment room that misses. Terrence's ring did not open, one of the 2 keys that open nothing anyone need open, and she did not force it, because she had told him she would rather hear it from him by daylight, but she laid her hand flat on the cold wood, the way she had laid it on the christening cup, and knew, with the certainty of the woman who reads, that whatever her husband had carried alone for 20 years was shut in that press, 3 feet from where he did his lonely accounts, and that he had left it locked not to keep her out, but because he did not yet dare hope she would want to be let in. She unsilenced the house by degrees that spring, because she could not help it, and because she had begun, without ever deciding to love him. She rang no bells. She would have cut off her hand before she rang a bell in that house, but she brought sound back in the shapes it could bear. She had the shrouded music room opened, and the old harp restrung, and in the evenings, when he sat over his books, pretending not to listen, she played it. Low, soft old airs with no words, and watched out of the side of her eye the way the marked hands would go still on the page. She read aloud to him at night. She laughed. She had not known she had much laughter in her, having had small call for it at Underhill. But the sound of it, in that house, was like water coming back into a dry course, and he would turn his whole scarred face to it, every time, helplessly, before he remembered to be a fortress. And one April evening at the harp, breaking off in the middle of an air, she said, "To the harp and not to him. There is a bell somewhere in this house. Gabriel, not hung, you took them all down. But you did not break them, or sell them. I have read the accounts of that year to the last farthing, and there is no bell smashed and none sold. You took them down, and you kept them, somewhere in this house, in the dark, like everything else you keep. And one day I am going to find them, and I am going to want to know why a man keeps the very thing he cannot bear to hear." He did not answer. But he got up, after a while, and came and stood behind her at the harp, close, not touching, and then his marked left hand, the one he hid, the one he managed everything not to use, came down, very carefully, as though it might not be allowed, and rested on her shoulder, the scarred palm of it warm through the gray silk. And he said, in a voice she had not heard him use, rough and low and unsteady, "Eleanor, only that." Her name, by itself, as the whole of the sentence, and not the address on the front of it. The first time in the whole of her life that anyone had said her name as though it were the point of everything. And she sat very still under the burnt hand, and did not turn round, because she knew that if she turned round she would weep, and she did not want him to think, ever, that she wept for pity. The great fire, the second fire of this story, the one that told the truth about the first, came in the raw wet dark of a night at April's end, in the village, where a spark from a banked hearth got into the thatch of a cottage while the shepherd Dice and his wife slept, and the wind off the moor took it. Eleanor woke to the light of it on her ceiling, red and moving, and to shouting far off. And to something worse, the sound, from below, of a man's boots going down the stairs 3 at a time, and the great door flung back, and a horse brought round at the gallop before anyone had rightly waked. And she was at the window in time to see, by the light of the burning, her husband ride down the avenue toward the fire like a man riding at guns, bareheaded, in his shirt, the marked hands bare on the reins. She followed. She flung on a cloak, and had the old cob saddled and rode down into the village behind him, and what she saw there she carried the rest of her life. She saw the whole street out in the red dark, the men with buckets making their useless chain from the horse pond, the roof of the Dice cottage gone entirely to flame, and the villagers standing back from it the way people stand back from a thing that cannot be helped, and the beast of Aldermere, the monster of 20 years of firelight stories, go off his horse at the run, and straight in through the burning door, into the smoke and the falling thatch, without a half-second's pause, while the whole street cried out, and no man there had the courage to follow. He brought the shepherd out first, over his shoulder, and put him down in the mud and went back. He brought the wife out the second time, half carrying, and the roof came down behind them in a great gout of sparks as they cleared the door, and he beat the fire out of the woman's clothes with his own bare-marked hands, and then knelt a moment with his head down, coughing the smoke out of himself. Before the men, shamed, brave, now that the thing was done, came and pulled them all clear, and Eleanor, running, reached him as he knelt, and got her arm under him, and heard the whole street fall into a silence quite different from any she had met at Aldermere. The silence of 100 people watching the monster they had been told about for 20 years kneel in the mud, with his hands burnt fresh, having gone into a fire, twice, that not one of them had dared, to bring out 2 of their own, and understanding altogether, slowly in the red light, that they had been telling the wrong story about this man for as long as most of them had been alive. She got him home. She would not let the surgeon touch him till she had washed his hands herself, in the warm, shielded light of her own room, the fresh burns over the old, and it was there, at last, with his ruined hands in her lap and the one safe lamp burning between them, that the Duke of Aldermere told his wife the truth, because a man who has just watched a woman run toward a fire he was already inside cannot, it turns out, go on lying to her by so much as a silence. "You wear that ring for your Uncle Hugh," he said, looking at the jet where it lay against his burnt hand. "You have worn it in my house 6 months, going to a man you believed had murdered him, and been kind to me anyway, which is the thing that has undone me, the being kind while you still believed. So I will tell you what I have told no living soul in 20 years, and then you may do with your ring and your true name whatever you must, and I will not say a word against it." He drew a breath that shook. "I did not set the fire at Fenn's Cross. Your Uncle Hugh set it. He went to the mill that night to burn the Aldermere muniments stored there, the old boundary rolls, because those rolls prove past any lawyer's undoing that the whole of Fenn's Cross and the meadow was Aldermere land, and always had been. That your family's 30-year suit was built on a miscopied bound 3 generations old, and that if they ever came into a court the Vanes would lose everything and be shown to have fought a lie. He chose to burn the proof and cry it an Aldermere spite, and win by ash what he could not win by right. But he was no incendiary, only a desperate man with a pitch-can in the dark, and the fire took him before he was clear of it. He made himself go on. I was 18, and awake, and I saw the light and ran down and went in after him, not knowing whose fire it was or why, only that there was a man in it. And I got to him. And he was already gone, Eleanor. That is the one mercy in the whole black business, and I want you to have it. The smoke had him before ever the flame did. I got him toward the door, and the burning floor gave under us. And that is where I got this." the jaw, the hands, and I dragged him out onto the grass. And he was dead. And I rang the mill bell. That is the bell your county has cursed me with for 20 years, the beast's gloating knell. I rang it with these hands already burnt, hauling on the rope till the skin came off them, to wake the village and bring help for a man already past helping. Because I was a boy, and could think of nothing to do with the horror of it, but make a noise, the biggest noise I could reach, so the whole world would wake and come. That is the ringing. That is all it ever was. A burnt boy hauling a bell in the dark for the dead. Eleanor held his hands and did not weep yet, because she understood, with the whole of her reading, that he was not finished, and that the worst was still coming. And when I had him out, I found the pitch can. And I found, in his coat, a letter in his own hand, meant for your grandfather, laying out the whole of it, boasting of it almost. Proof, Eleanor, that Hugh Vane died burning down my mill to destroy the truth, and that your family's whole cause and 30 years of hatred stood on a lie he had known for a lie, and died to keep. I was 18. I stood on that grass with the proof in my hand and your dead uncle at my feet, and I could have cleared myself in a morning. And I could not do it. Your grandmother was alive. Your father was a young man with his whole life to live under that name. There were Vane children not yet born. You were not born, who would grow up the get of an arsonist. To clear my face, I had to blacken all of you forever, the guilty dead and the innocent living together, and there was no way to take the one and spare the rest. My father was dying, I asked him, the once, and he said the one soft thing of his life. Let it lie, boy. We can bear a lie told about us. They cannot bear the truth told about them. The strong carry the lie. That is what the strong are for. So I let it lie. I sealed the letter in a press 3 feet from where I do my accounts, and I let the county call me the beast, and I took down my bells, because I could not hear one rung without being back on that grass with the skin coming off my hands. That is the wound. Not the face healed. The wound is 20 years of being hated for the one wholly good thing I ever did, by the very people I ruined myself to spare, and never once being able to say so. That is what you married, sight unseen, in your uncle's mourning ring. Now you know. Take the ring off, if you can, or leave it on, if you can't, and either way, God help me, either way I love you. Which I have had no business doing to a woman I bought, and have done anyway, since about the 3rd boundary roll. The lamp burned steady between them, the one safe flame in the silent house. And Eleanor Vane, Eleanor of Aldermere, sat with her uncle's murderer's burnt hands in her lap, and found she was not shaking, and that the low lifelong hum of grievance she had been raised inside, the family drone of the wrong done to the Vanes, the thing she had taken all her life for simply the sound of being alive, had gone silent in her, as though a hand had come down on a struck string. And she reached down with her own steady hand and drew the jet mourning ring off her finger, slowly over the knuckle, and set it on the table beside the basin, in the light. I take it off, she said, not because you asked. You did not ask. You told me I might, which is a better thing, but because I will not wear a lie on my hand now I know it for one, and that ring has been a lie my whole life, and I the last to learn it. But I do not take it off for Hugh, Gabriel, hear me, for I am only going to say it once. My family has mourned the wrong man for 20 years. They put jet on a young girl's hand for an arsonist, and taught her to hate the boy who burned himself, carrying that arsonist out of his own fire, and then beggared his own name to keep her family's secret safe. Well, I am the one Vane who has been told the truth, and I find I am the only mourner this house has ever been allowed, so I will do the mourning properly, For once, for the right person, not for Hugh, who chose the fire, but for the boy of 18 who ran into it and has been alone in the burning ever since. Give me your hands. You are not alone in it any longer. That is the one thing I can give you that no settlement drew, and I give it freely, and there is no clause, and it is full and final and cannot be reopened. Now be still, my dear, and let me see to these. You have burnt the good you had left of them saving a shepherd, and I will not have my husband's hands lost to me the same week I finally learnt I had a husband. Everything after was different, and nothing changed on the face of it, which is the way of the deepest changes. They did not tell the county. There was nothing to gain and a whole family's ruin to lose. And Eleanor came without hesitation to the place her husband had stood alone on for 20 years, that the strong carry the lie, and that she was strong now, stronger with two than he had ever been with one. But the marriage was no longer a marriage of purchase on either side, and both knew it. And if the story of the beast did not die all at once, stories do not, it began, from the night of the dice fire outward, quietly to rot at the root, the way even the oldest lie will, once one true thing is finally allowed to stand up beside it in the daylight. And then, in the summer, her family came back. It came in the person of her Uncle Ambrose, in a hired chaise, on a bright July morning, with his best coat on, and his old assurance, and, beside him, a narrow smiling attorney with a portfolio under his arm, a Mr. Sneed of the town, and which Eleanor had not looked for, and her uncle plainly considered his masterstroke, Arabella. Arabella, in a traveling dress the color of a wasp, more beautiful than ever, and somehow sharpened, the way gilt sharpens when the plate beneath it wears through. Arabella, whose grand match had come to nothing over the winter, the London gentleman having discovered upon inquiry exactly how little was left at Underhill. Arabella, deployed now upon the steps of Aldermere as a reproach and an exhibit, see, said her lovely sulky presence, the daughter you should have had. Eleanor received all three in the great library with unimpeachable tea, and watched her cousin's eyes go round the room pricing the very folios, and watched her uncle arrange his face into injury, and waited, because she had learned that the one who waits is the one who wins, and that a Vane with a grievance will always, given rope enough, say the quiet part aloud. Her husband stood by the cold summer hearth, silent at her asking. She had told him the night before what she meant to do, and he had argued, and she had heard him out and then said, "No, my dear, you have spent 20 years being the strong one who carries the lie. It is my turn, and it is my family, and it is a lawsuit, and if there is one thing a Vane who reads was bred for it, is the ending of a lawsuit. Stand by the fire and be silent, which will cost you more than the dice cottage did, and watch what your cowardly mercy bought you, 20 years on, the daughter who reads." And he had bowed his head and obeyed. Mr. Sneyd opened, as such men open, with a full half-hour of smiling regret. The painful reduction of Mr. Vane's circumstances, the peculiar, he must say irregular, history of the Aldermere settlement, the substitution, at the 11th hour, of one Vane daughter for another. Eleanor drank her tea, without fresh consideration or full consent. The very real questions any court of equity must entertain as to whether a peace so hastily bound could be said to bind at all, and the earnest wish of his client to compose the whole matter privately, within the family, upon terms which, given the resources of the parties, would be felt by nobody. "Name the terms, Mr. Sneed," said Eleanor pleasantly. "You have been half an hour not naming them, and the tea is going cold, and my husband, who is silent by that fire out of courtesy to my wish, and not from any want of things he could say, has burnt hands that pain him when he sits too long, so I would take it kindly if you would come to the figure." Mr. Sneed put off his stroke, named the figure. "An annuity to Mr. Ambrose Vane, secured on the Aldermere estate, the discharge of certain further obligations, a schedule to follow, and a suitable and separate provision for Miss Arabella Vane, whose expectations, he bowed toward the wasp-colored dress, had suffered so cruelly, and whose sacrifice of the position that might so naturally have been hers had never been recognized. "Whose sacrifice?" said Eleanor. "Yes, I see. Thank you, Mr. Sneed. That is admirably clear. And I will now be equally clear, and then there will be an end, and you shall all be back in the chaise before the good horses take cold." She set down her cup. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised it once in the whole of this story, and did not intend to begin for Mr. Sneed. "Your case is that the peace does not bind, because the wrong sister was married in a hurry, that the great suit over Fenn's Cross may therefore be reopened, and that my husband will pay a very great deal rather than have it reopened. Have I the shape of it?" "Your Grace states it with a lawyer's economy," said Mr. Sneed, smiling. "I had a good master this winter. Now attend, because I am going to save us all a summer in Chancery." Mr. Ray, the Duke's grey solicitor, who had been sitting unregarded in the window with the locked box at his feet, rose. "The first document, if you please." Ray laid it on the table, turned to face the visitors, a great sheet of old brown vellum in an ancient hand. "The Aldermere boundary roll," he said, dry as a law-calf's binding, "the oldest and authentic terrier of these lands, untouched in the muniments 3 generations. I will trouble the company to attend to the bound at Fenn's Cross. Here the exact grey finger came down, which sets the mill and the whole of the water meadow within the Aldermere line plainly, past any construction, and has done since a time when no Vane had yet dreamt of a claim to it. The suit your client proposes to revive was founded 3 generations back upon a later and careless copy, in which a single bound was misset by a clerk long dead. The error is here demonstrable. Her Grace found it herself, at the settlement table, before ever she signed. Reopen the suit, if you please. You will not be reopening a question, you will be inviting a court to rule, once and finally, and on the record forever, that the Vane claim to Fenn's Cross never had any foundation in law at all, and every soul in the county will then know your family fought 30 years and beggared 2 houses over a bound a dead clerk copied wrong. That is the whole of what a lawsuit would buy you, Mr. Sneed, publicity for your own defeat." The library was very quiet. Mr. Sneed read the bound at Fenn's Cross, and his smile did not so much fall as quietly cease to be renewed. Arabella had stopped pricing the folios, and Ambrose Vane's assurance had begun the maneuver his niece knew of old. The slow shift into injured innocence that was the only defense the man had ever owned. "An old map," Ambrose said, rallying. "An old map and a clever woman. Juries are not surveyors. Niece, there is doubt enough in an old bound to trouble any settlement, and doubt is all that. The distress of a public airing, the scandal, the questions as to the peculiar history of your own marriage. Ah, the scandal. Yes, I wondered when we should come to it, for it is the only real coin in your purse, uncle, the old map having spent the rest. You mean you will rake it all through the newspapers, the beast, the burnt mill, the murdered brother, the wrong sister smuggled to the monster, until my husband pays you to be quiet. That is the true offer under Mr. Sneed's flowers, and we may as well have it bare on the table." She rose, and crossed to the deed box at Ray's feet, and took from it herself a small flat packet, sealed, the wax gone dark with age, and she came back and set it on the tea-table between herself and her uncle, and rested her hand upon it. "Then let me show you the second document, uncle," she said, very gently. "Not Mr. Ray. This one is family, and I will handle it myself. Do you know what this is? You do not. No living Vane knows what this is, save me, and I have known it 3 months and told no one. This is a letter. It is in a Vane hand. You would know the hand. Uncle, it is your own brother's. It is Hugh's. It was found on his body on the grass at Fenn's Cross 20 years ago by the 18-year-old boy who dragged him out of the fire he was too dead to be saved from. The fire. Uncle, that Hugh set. That Hugh set, with a pitch can, in the night, to burn these very rolls, because he had learnt what Mr. Ray has just shown you, that the Vanes had no case, had never had a case, and that the only way left to win was to burn the truth to ash and cry at Aldermere's spite. It is all here, in his own hand, boasting of it to your father. My husband has kept it sealed 20 years. He could have cleared his face in a morning with it, any morning these 20 years, and ruined every Vane alive to do it. And he did not. He took the county's hatred and your family's curses, and he took down his own bells, because he could not bear the sound of them, and he let you all go on mourning an arsonist as a martyr, and teaching your children to hate the one honest man in the whole affair, rather than blacken your name in the dust, where by every law of God and England it belonged. That is the man you sold me to, uncle. That is the monster. He has protected this family at the cost of his own good name and his own peace, and very nearly his own life, for 20 years, and not one of you has ever known it, and he never meant a soul to know. The room had gone entirely still. Ambrose Vane was the color of the old vellum. Arabella was staring at the sealed packet as though it were a live coal, and Mr. Sneed, very quietly, had begun to buckle his portfolio, which is the sound a good attorney makes, instead of striking his colors. So here is my offer, uncle, and it does not come from my husband, who would never make it, but from me, who am under no such delicacy where my own blood is concerned. You will sign today, before Mr. Ray, and before your own Mr. Sneed. A final and perpetual quitclaim, the suit dead forever, every Vane claim to Fenn's Cross renounced root and branch. Full and final, the words you taught me to fear as a girl, turned now to the guarding of this house. And in return, this packet stays sealed. Hugh's name stays a martyr's. And the county need never learn the Vanes fought a generation for a lie and got a man killed for it. Your family's honor, whole and undeserved, for your signature on a paper that costs you nothing but a lawsuit you were always going to lose. Refuse it, and I will not spare you as he spared you. I am not so good as my husband, uncle, and I have had 24 years of this family to cure me of any wish to be. I will read this letter into open court on the first day of the hearing, and watch the name of Vane go down in fire a second time, properly this time. Choose. You have until the tea is cold, and I find I no longer much care which you decide. Which is the freest I have felt in the whole of my life. Ambrose Vane looked at his plain niece across the tea-table, really looked. Perhaps for the first time in the 24 years he had been overlooking her, and what looked steadily back at him was not for sale, had never been for sale, had in fact, in the vestry back in December when he thought he was selling her, been quietly buying him. Buying, with a signature and a mourning ring and 6 months' patient reading, the whole future of a family that had valued her at nothing. He looked at the sealed packet. He looked at the boundary roll. He looked, last and longest, at the tall, scarred, silent man by the cold hearth, who had carried his family's blackest secret 20 years, and never asked a farthing nor a word of thanks. And something in Ambrose Vane's face, which had performed injuries so long it had half forgotten how to do anything else, performed for one unguarded moment the thing underneath the injury, which was shame. "Give me the paper," he said hoarse. "Give me the paper, Sneed, and let us be gone. I will sign it. God forgive us all." And he signed the quitclaim at the tea-table in the July light, and the great suit of Vane against Aldermere, 30 years and 2 fortunes and 1 man's life in the making, ended in the scratch of a pen, and the sealed packet went back into the box, unopened, into the dark, where it would stay. Arabella spoke only once. At the door, while Sneed got the defeated portfolio into the chaise, and Ambrose stood grey and shrunk on the steps, she turned back to her cousin, and looked at her, the plain sister, the spent one. The Duchess in the great warm house with the scarred man watching her from the hall, as no man had ever in his life watched Arabella, and she said, low and bitter and, for the only time in her life, wholly honest, you always did read the things the rest of us threw away, Nell, the old maps, the account books, Uncle's dull letters. We used to laugh at you for it. I used to think it was because you had nothing better to look at. Her lovely eyes went once round the hall, the man, the marriage, and something in her face finished falling. It was never because you had nothing better. Was it? No, said Eleanor, not unkindly. It was never because I had nothing better. Goodbye, Arabella. The tenant clause holds. You and my uncle keep your roofs, whatever else you have lost this morning. I saw to that in December, before I knew any of the rest. Go home. Be as well as you can. And it was then, and only then, in the whole of that long morning that the Duke of Aldermere spoke. From the doorway of his own house, in the low, rough, carrying voice that had once cried a burning village awake, Mr. Vane, Ambrose stopped on the steps and turned. You sold her, said the Duke, for acres, believing me the man who murdered your brother. You sent the one honest soul your family ever bred into what you took for a monstrous house, to save yourselves a lawsuit. And she has spent this morning saving your name from the fire your brother lit, which is a mercy neither you nor I would have had the strength for. So I will say the thanks you cannot, and then you will go. Thank you, Mr. Vane, for the only wholly good thing you ever did in your life, which you did by accident, greedily, for land, believing it a cruelty. You gave me my wife. Now get down the steps of this house, and do not come up them again. Good day. The chaise rolled. The broken avenue took it, and the lodge, and the road, and Eleanor stood on the steps of Aldermere in the July light, and felt her husband come to stand at her shoulder, and found that what she felt, watching her family go, was neither triumph nor grief, but the sensation of a very long sum at last proved, and ruled off, and under it, rising, quiet and enormous, the whole rest of her life. She found the bells in September, in the darkest of the muniment room presses, the second of the 2 keys, for he had given her both the day after Ambrose signed, laying them on the harp without a word. Behind the door, wrapped in baize and furred with 20 years of dust, lay the bells of Aldermere, the stable bell and the chapel bell and the little handbells, and, greatest of all, laid by itself and wrapped twice, the mill bell of Fenn's cross, the bell a burnt boy had hauled in the dark for the dead. She did not ask him about it that day. She waited until the mill itself was rebuilt, for she had set masons on Fenn's cross that summer, over his first flinching objection, and then with his slow help, clearing the black shell and raising the good stone new. A working mill again for the 9 tenant families, whose grain had gone 20 miles to grind for 20 years, and it was ready. All but the bell-cote empty at its gable, by the back end of October. There is a bell wanting at Fenn's cross, she said to him then, one evening at the harp. The masons have left the coat for it. I have found your bells, Gabriel. You knew I would. You gave me the key. And I am going to hang the mill bell back where it belongs, over living people grinding honest corn. Not to torment you, I would sooner die than torment you. But because a bell is only a sound, my dear, and a sound means whatever the people who hear it have agreed it means, and your county agreed 20 years ago, in ignorance and cruelty, that this bell meant a monster gloating. I mean to teach it to mean something else. I mean to ring it on our own day, over our own mill, until the sound of it in this valley stops meaning the night your uncle-in-law died, and starts meaning the morning the Vanes and the Aldermeres finally stopped killing each other over a bound a dead clerk copied wrong. You need not be there. But I should like it to be your hand on the rope, this time, and mine over it, and the skin staying on for once. He was silent so long she thought she had lost. Then he said, in the ruined voice, you would hang that bell, and ring it. And you think I could stand and hear it. I think you could stand and hear it with my hand over yours on the rope, which is the one condition under which you have never yet heard anything in 20 years, because there was never anyone's hand over yours. Yes, I think it is the last room in this house still shut, not a room of stone, the room in you where the bell still rings the old way, and I think we open it the way we have opened all the others, together, by daylight, slowly, with the fire's bank safe. Trust me one more time. I have not been wrong about a document yet, and I am not wrong about this. That sound is not your enemy. It never was. It was only ever a boy in the dark trying to wake the world to come and help. Let us wake the world to something better, you and I, and let the bell say what we tell it to say. For once, instead of what the cruel and the ignorant told it to say when you were too young and too alone to answer them. They rang the mill bell at Fenn's Cross on the last Thursday of October, at the harvest home for the 9 restored farms, and the whole valley came. The whole valley would have crawled there over the stubble to see it. They came prepared, most of them, for the country people are slow to forgive their own stories, and slower to admit they were ever wrong, and they stood in the mill yard in the thin, bright autumn cold, with their old certainties held ready. And they saw the Duke of Aldermere climb up into the bellcote of the mill his family was said to have burned, bareheaded, his scarred hands bare on the new rope, and they saw his wife climb up beside him and lay her hand over his, and they saw the two of them together ring the mill bell of Fenn's Cross out over the water for the first time in 20 years, not tolling, not a knell, but a peal. A wild, bright, uneven, joyful clangour, badly rung, laughing before the end, the way two people ring who have never rung a bell before and do not care who knows it, and there was not a soul in that yard who had been raised on the story of the beast's gloating bell, who did not stand and hear it turn, in the ringing, into something else. The cruel old thing picked up out of the ashes and carried into the light. Lady Sturt, who had been Cassandra Aldous, who had thrown him over, came to Aldermere that Christmas, angling the invitation through a cousin of a cousin, and came up the drive stout and bright and brittle, trailing a baronet husband with a face like a bill overdue, prepared for coldness, for a scene, for the exquisite revenge the wronged may serve at their own hearths. And the Duke met her in his hall with his scarred face open and easy, and bowed over her hand with a flawless, weightless courtesy, and said, Lady Sturt, you are very welcome. May I present my wife? And turned to Eleanor with his whole grave face gone warm. And that was all, and Cassandra understood, in the time it takes to rise from a curtsy, that she had been, these 20 years, not mourned, not hated, not so much as remembered, merely recovered from, and she made a very good dinner, and went home, and was never heard by any servant of that house to name the family again. The years came, and did what years do to a happiness built on rock, made it larger, and quieter, and far more amused. The shrouded rooms opened one by one, the shutters came down, the wild avenue was cut, and the park brought back. The county came round, as the county always comes round, some 10 years after its own housekeepers, and the story of the beast wore away by slow degrees into a milder and truer one, until the children of the valley grew up knowing Aldermere only as the great kind house at the end of the mended avenue, and did not much believe there had ever been another tale. The bells were hung again, all of them, at the Duke's own word, and if the ringing still cost him something on the bad days, he never let it cost him so much that he took them down again. Because his wife's hand was over his now on every rope in his life, and a man can bear the ringing of any bell in the world, it turns out, if only there is a hand over his while it rings. The jet ring never went back on her hand. It lay instead, from that April night onward, in the small cedar box on her dressing table where she kept the things that mattered. And beside it, put there by her own hand the day the masons finished Fenn's cross, lay a single scrap of the old burnt mill rope, saved from the clearing, the thrown-away thing and the kept thing, the family's false mourning and the true. And on an evening now and again, the servants knowing to be elsewhere, the two of them would open the little box and look a while, together, at the whole story folded small, a mourning ring for the wrong man, and a length of scorched rope for the right one, and between them the 20 silent years. Ended. The sealed packet stayed in its dark press to the end of both their lives and past it. And no Vane ever knew what it had cost, or been spared, which was exactly as the man who sealed it had always meant. They were married 33 years. He told her of the rain a day early, all his life out of his aching hands, and was never once wrong. She read the documents, kept the fires banked safe, and taught a whole valley to hear a bell without a shudder. And there was not a soul in that once silent house who did not come at last to hold what the county itself came round to holding, 30 years too late as usual, that the plain Vane daughter, the one they could spare, the one worth a signature and no more, had made the great marriage of her generation, that the girl nobody troubled to look at had been, all along, the one worth looking for, and that it was she, stooping as she always stooped for the discarded thing, who had picked the whole cast-off truth up out of the ashes at last, and mended it and carried it, past every warning she had been raised on, into the only house in England where a man had spent 20 years alone, waiting for someone honest enough to be told. The bell had tolled once for a monster who never was. Now it rang for the man who always had been. She had gone to Aldermere to seal a peace with a signature, and had found, in the muniment room and the mill yard and the burnt hands she washed in her own lap, that the peace had been made 20 years before she ever came, in the dark, by the very man they sent her to fear. At a cost the whole grasping length of her family together could never have paid. She had worn a false ring for the wrong grief, she had taken it off for the right one. And the bell had tolled once for a monster who never was. Now it rang, all down that reconciled valley, for the man who always had been. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from, and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly, so you won't miss the next one.